Hello, my name is Ryan. I run new growth strategies and I help businesses run more efficiently, particularly businesses with fewer than 20 employees that also serve other businesses. Today, we are going to be talking about systems because this is the heart of what I do, what I build. The core focus is really just how we visualize, analyze, and build operation systems around different parts of the business. And to understand how to do that properly, we have to understand systems, how they're composed, and how all this works. So let's get into it. My thesis is that there are three kinds of systems. The first kind of system is the most simple kind of system, and this is a linear system. A trigger happens, and then an output happens. Let's say a form is filled out on your website. That would be the trigger. What happens after that is the output. And in this case, this would be maybe an email sent to you or someone added into your CRM. Instead, if there's something more complex in the process, we could have something called a conditional workflow, where a trigger happens and a set of different outputs can happen based on a given condition. Let's say the form fill out on your website asks a question like, are you a business or are you an individual? The condition could be, if they're a business, then scenario A happens. If they're an individual, then scenario B happens. If neither applies or it's unknown, then scenario C happens. Other examples of this could be like a true or false scenario, where it's like a simple, if it's true, then this happens. If it's not true, then this other thing happens. So what happens when there's an even more complex process? Then you might have what's called a cognitive workflow, where a trigger happens, but a decision has to be made in the middle by a human, for example. And what the human would use is a system that could be the system that lives in their head. They know what decision needs to be made based on this trigger. So using the same example of the website form, let's say a website form comes in and it gets sent to your inbox for review. And then you have to decide if that's going to go to your CRM or if that's going to go to someone in your team or something else happens entirely. What could then happen is when that email is sent to you, you have one block that shows the contact form information, and then you get two buttons. You either click one button and say, this goes to a team member, or you click another button and say, this goes to the CRM. But you are ultimately deciding what the outcome is. Now let's talk about different kinds of processes. So one thing that could happen is a trigger happens and then many items appear from that trigger. So let's say, using the website form example, let's say you've collected 50 website form fill outs and you have that stored in a database somewhere. The trigger could be you press a button and it calls all that data. Now you have 50 items in a list. And now a process could happen, and that could mean any one of these three things, but a process happens to each individual item and it goes through this process 50 times, one time for each item, right? We could also have aggregate processes. So let's say you have form fill outs and then you also have the number of sales calls that were made from these form fill outs. But you have these stored in separate lists, like maybe this one's in a CRM and this one's in a Google Sheet. The last thing I want to get into is this whole idea of what triggers are. So simply put, there are two kinds. We have schedules and events. A schedule would be, for example, something happens every day, Monday through Friday at 9 a.m. The other thing that could happen is an event, such as an email comes in, therefore a process happens, or something happens in another app like your CRM, therefore this happens, or a web form gets filled out, therefore the process happens. So these could be app events, API calls, webhooks, or even just manual events like you pushing a button, but it's all triggered by an event happening, not necessarily on a schedule. Now let's take a look at what this looks like in n8n. This is my go-to no-code or low-code building platform for simple automations. So let's build a workflow going through each of these examples. So the first one we have is a linear workflow. So trigger happens, therefore an output happens. So let's say that I trigger something manually. When I click a button, then something happens. This could be something like, send me an email. We are going to send a message. I'll choose one of these email accounts to send from. This would be like test. Okay, that's it. I click execute workflow, therefore it sends an email. Another more practical example, like the form fill out I was referring to earlier, would be when a form gets submitted, then an email is sent to you. This could also be all that information is sent directly to a CRM or to Google Sheets or something like that. But let's say for this example that it's an email. So in this example, I just put in one single form. And so in the email, whenever this field gets filled out, this will be just field A is then the result. Okay. So let's test it out. So I send that and then it sends me an email. Let's take a look at what that looks like. Look at that, new form fill. Great. And of course, in any normal form, you would add several fields, but that's beyond the scope of this test. Obviously, when you fill out a form on your website, it's going to have a lot more fields. This is just a very simple example. So now, let's build a example conditional workflow. So we're going to use the same form fill out and then add a condition in here that based on the field that's filled in. So I'm going to keep the workflow the same, but then add in the middle a condition. So in this case, this is a true or false condition. So if one thing happens, then it goes on, and if that doesn't apply, then it goes through another branch. In n8n, it does have a way to split, so you can have as many branches as you want using the split field. So if this field, we'll say if it contains the word test, then that would go through the true branch, and then it sends an email. And if it's false, it's going to do nothing. So let's run that again. This time I'm going to test it without the word test in it, right? Because in this condition, it needs to contain the word test. And then therefore it should go to this branch, just like that. If I do it again, and I say just test, then it goes to that branch, right? This is conditional logic. If it contains something or if it matches a condition, then it goes through that branch. If not, then it goes to that branch. But like I said, you can also replace this with something like the split node, and we can say for the first branch, for this first one, we'll say if it contains the word test, like we were saying, we'll label this if test, then it goes through this branch. If the same field, we'll say does not contain the word test, then it goes through this branch. Oops. And we'll rename this if not test. We'll add another routing rule, a third condition that just says if this field is empty, then these two are going to do nothing, but this one is going to send an email. Okay? Oh, what's nice now is now we have 3 branches and they're all properly labeled. And what I'm going to do in this case, for example, is in the first branch, if the form fill contains the word test, then it sends an email. If it does not contain the word test, then it does nothing. Or if the form itself is empty, then it also does nothing. And you can go on and on about these based on conditional logic and build entire systems just based on this being fully deductive. It fully reduces to something to conditional outputs, right? And in all of these cases, I don't have to be involved in the decision-making process because the condition is pretty black or white, right? But what if I do have to be involved in the decision-making process? We can add human in the loop. So if it's empty, maybe I'll say that it's going to request human review. And it's going to send me a message. It's going to send me an email to the same one. And we're also going to add an approve button. We could say approve or disapprove. And this is going to add it to the email. So now we should have a couple bits of logic for what happens after the email comes back. So let's test this out. So if I submit it and it's blank, all right, I'm going to swap these conditions around a little bit because I want to prioritize if it's empty or not. So now if we run this again, if it's empty, it's going to go to this branch. So I'm just going to fill out an empty form here. Okay. So now, if everything's correct, it'll send me a new email. That part out. So now that I've sent a blank form through, now it's going to ask for my review and send me that approval email that we requested. So there it is, the review requested. And this is just approve or decline. So if it approves, then that's all done. And let's see what it returned. Okay, so it brought back this field approved equals true, right? So that then allows me to create an additional process like another if statement. So let's say if after this approved is equal to true, then it does. So let's say if it's approved equals true, it goes to, I don't know, sheets. And it's going to update a row in a spreadsheet. Now what that row is going to be and where, I don't know. I'm not going to build that in this example, but you see what I mean? So if it's false, then let's just say that does nothing. So now we've built this process, this workflow for a very rudimentary, impractical workflow, albeit, but this is how you go from a simple linear workflow where one thing happens and therefore something else happens to a conditional logic workflow to something that has full human in the loop approval mechanisms. So these aren't all exclusive from each other. They really build onto each other. A linear workflow can grow into a conditional workflow, which can then grow into a human in the loop workflow. And these triggers can all be changed as well. So let's say that instead of on a form submission, that we replaced it with a schedule. So we can set up what's called a cron job. And n8n makes this really easy. So every day at midnight is the default setting, then it triggers the rest of the process, right? Now this doesn't yet account for the aggregation and looping processes. So let's build another workflow that covers those. I'm going to just do a manual trigger. And what we're going to do is we're going to aggregate data from two sources and process that. So I'm going to pull data from two apps. First one I'll pull from is, say, Google Sheets. I'm just going to pick a document and pull all the rows from it. Now we have 233 items in one branch, and we're going to add another node. And in this other node, we're going to get all of the emails in one of my inboxes. So we will pull from Gmail this time. What I'm going to do is just get the most 50 messages that I sent from this email address. If I go ahead and execute that, we should see 50 items. Boom, there we go. It pulls all the rows and it pulls all the emails. So I'm going to match the email field from Sheets with the to field in email. And when I do this, now we have 19 matching items. So I've now matched 19 of the sent emails from this inbox to 19 rows from here. And so maybe I can put this into a report for example, and say, these 19 emails match these, and then update this sheet or something like that, right? So this is an example of a very quick, basic example of data aggregation, and in this case, item matching. So if we scroll all the way down to aggregate processes, that's how that works. Now the last one we haven't covered quite yet are loop processes. So let's say that instead of aggregating everything together, that I wanted to take all the emails in here, what I could do, in this example it wouldn't be super practical, but what I could do then is run a loop. So everything splits off in batches, and in this case we can do batch of 1, or we could do, for example, 10 at a time, depending on your use case. I won't get into that today, but basically it's going to loop over this idea of filtering and keeping these, and then go back over all of our items and run 1 at a time. And when it's done, then you could send a message or something, but in this case I'm just going to do nothing. So now we can watch in real time what happens when it loops over the same process over and over again. So once this triggers, all the emails get pulled up and all 50 items run into the loop, and each one at a time is going to go through this filtration process, right? So now let's talk about a loop process. This one gets interesting because it depends on your use case. Fortunately, in tools like n8n, most of the time when it's an individual item, then if you get many items, then if you need to loop through, then it just does it automatically. So let's take a look at my email triage agent. So for example, the way I've got this set up is that once a week, it pulls up all the messages in my email inbox and loops over each one of them based on its condition. For all 50 of them, it's going to go through this loop. It's going to enter here and then be analyzed by an AI agent that knows how to classify my emails, and it's going to label them, which you can see here, based on whether it's a sales email, something about outreach or support or admin or internal, or a purchase invoice or notes. It's going to email them. It's going to label the email as one of these categories, right? In this case, the loop makes the most sense because there are several different processes based on the condition, but this wasn't able to process, for example, all 50 emails all at the same time like it normally would. It had to loop through potentially another sub-process, if that makes sense. So we've also covered what happens for a scheduled trigger versus an event trigger, right? In this workflow, the schedule runs every once in a while, but if I were to swap this for a manual trigger where it just executes the workflow, then that automatically happens. Or an event-based trigger would be if an email is received, like this one, once a message gets received from this inbox, then it proceeds to just automatically go through the rest of the workflow. So that's an event depending on the use case, right? Now, you might be wondering, why is all this important? Why does it matter? Because right now, what you might already be doing, if you're watching this video, is you might already have all these things in place. Like you're monitoring your email. When a new website form comes in, then it gets sent to your email, but then you have to go update that in CRM or in your spreadsheets. If a form fill comes in through the ads, maybe you are getting the email, but you are still the one that has to be in the loop for all of this, right? So what I'm trying to illustrate is the possibilities of connecting all this into a more unified system so that everything cross-communicates and you interact with a system, therefore saving you time. Because the truth is, with this kind of a structure, is you are the system, right? Workflows don't happen without you or your team in the middle of it. And this is both expensive for time because it costs a lot of time to keep everything updated, but with that also leaves a lot of margin for error, right? The reason why this is important is because when you have an email connected to your invoicing, connected to your CRM, connected to everything else, then you have a real unified system that you are just interacting with. Okay? A lot of what happens in here, you can just automate that workflow. And it saves you the time, it saves you money in time, but it also saves you that margin of error so that you don't have to be manually responsible. It also saves you all that potential margin of error because you don't have to be personally responsible for potential faults in entering in the wrong thing or forgetting to enter the wrong thing or what have you, right? I reckon that the vast majority of what goes on in a business every day can be automated in the back end, whether it requires a human in the loop or AI, or if it's just a simple linear deterministic workflow. A lot of it's very possible, and a lot of it is very necessary too. And again, this is all to save on time and error. And this is the ultimate use case of leveraging a system for your business, right? So if that's something that you are struggling with, if you feel like this is what your business looks like and you want your business to look like this, then I would love to be your partner in realizing that goal. Get in touch with me on my website, newgrowth.com, link in the description, or connect with me on LinkedIn, also in the description. That's it for today. Best of luck with your workflows.